Well, good morning. Today we're going to continue to talk about imperialism in the 19th century. And today we're going to be looking at two countries in particular. One is Russia and one is the United States. We're looking at the handout called Manifest Destinies, Russia and the United States. Well, first of all, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the United States. We've talked a little bit about manifest destiny before, and we know that manifest destiny is this idea that the United States is destined to expand from the east to the west. And this idea of manifest destiny is going to be supported by different leaders at different times. And one of the leaders that's going to really early on support the idea of manifest destiny is the leader James Monroe, rather. In 1823, he issues the famous Monroe Doctrine. And that Monroe Doctrine argues that European countries should not intervene in the Americas. That European countries should not intervene in the Americas. And what that means and what that implies is that European countries should not intervene in the United States, in the Americas, because the U.S. would be the only would be in the Western Hemisphere the only imperial power. That the U.S. would be in the Western Hemisphere the only imperial power. And this is going to play out, we're going to see, when the United States goes to war with one of its neighbors. In 1845, the United States goes to war with one of its neighbors to the south, that's Mexico. And why did they go to war? Well, the issue of the war is over the border of Texas. Here we see the border of Texas. You might remember that Texas was very briefly for a small amount of time an independent nation, and after a brief period as a republic, Texas chose to join the United States. It's the only independent nation to choose to join the United States. And there was a bit of an argument, a bit of a debate over where the border of Texas was. Texas, for sure, was everything in yellow. But Mexico had the idea that the border of Texas and the border of Mexico was along the Nueces River, listed there. The Texans, on the other hand, claimed everything on this map in green, saying that the border actually went all the way to the Rio Grande. So there's two different visions about what Texas is, and this actually leads to the Mexican-American War, a conflict over the border of Texas. You can see two very different visions of what Mexico and the United States thought Texas entailed. Well, the United States and Mexico go to war in the Mexican-American War, and this is a very quick victory for the United States. And what does the United States get out of it? The United States gets everything on the map. For the United States, this meant adding 500,000 square miles. Now, you might also notice that all these states that the United States gets as a result of this war, well, they had literally nothing to do with the border dispute of what makes up Texas. You might remember that the border dispute was between land in the border of Texas between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, but the United States saw an opportunity for expansion, and they decided that if they're going to go to war with Mexico, they might as well go to war in a way that would lead them to take other area. For example, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, California, all these different states that were not a part of the original conflict now are part of the United States. The U.S. adds 500,000 square miles due to the Mexican-American War. And so this is an example of manifest destiny. It is America's destiny, they argue, that they would add so much land so quickly and at the expense of a people Americans at the time thought that were inferior. So throughout the 19th century, the U.S. not only continues to take land from other people, like the Mexican people, but from the native people as well. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. continued to take land from indigenous peoples. And that word indigenous, that means native peoples. And so it's not just established Western-style governments like Mexico the U.S. is taking land from. They're also taking land from Native Americans. And there's a problem here because, of course, the Native Americans were here first. And some of the Native Americans, like particularly the Cherokee, had actually westernized. They began to dress in American fashion. They began to use Western cultural practices. But even though these Cherokee and other Native Americans westernized, they were seen as being in the way. And because they were seen as being in the way, they had to be removed, the argument was. And so as a result, Native Americans were often forcibly relocated. You can see they were taken from places like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, the other locations in the South. They were forcibly relocated, and many of them were then sent to Indian Territory in what is modern-day Oklahoma. They were sent to Indian Territory in what is modern-day Oklahoma. And this is a pattern that we've seen before. We know this to be the Trail of Tears. This was under the direction of our president in 1830 as a result of the Indian Removal Act, and the name most associated with these actions is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is the president who really pushes to have Native Americans removed from the American Southeast. And this action of the Trail of Tears is where we see at least 60,000 Native Americans forced to move from their homelands. And of those 60,000 on the Trail of Tears, at least 10,000 are believed to have died. And of course, those numbers could be greater than that. These are just some rough estimates of how many people would have died. White Americans believed that they were entitled to this expansion due to manifest destiny. They believed it was their right. And they believed, especially as white people, that their white culture was superior to that of the Native Americans, who, even though they tried to westernize, were seen as not sufficiently white enough to be preserved. And of course, the Mexican people. The Mexican people, you might recall, are mestizos, not all, but mainly. And so they were actually even seen as inferior because they were a people that had European background, Spain, but they had been tainted by intermarriage with Native Americans. And so both of these people, the Mexican people to the south and the Native American people, were seen as culturally inferior. Well, here's a great picture that kind of encapsulates famously these ideas of manifest destiny. And here, manifest destiny is exemplified by this woman who is walking west. And if you take a look at this woman walking west, look at the very far east, and you're going to see some things in the picture that are synonymous with white American industrialized progress and power. You'll see ships on the far east, the far right of the picture. You'll see bridges on the far right, the far east of the country. You'll see trains, but take a look at what she's holding in her hand. Take a look at what she's holding in her hand. You'll notice she is carrying the telegraph. And we've talked about the role of the telegraph before, and we'll see behind her not only the telegraph but the train. These are the two things allowing the colonization and allowing the conquering of the American West. And what happens as she moves across the land? What does she bring with her? Well, she brings the trains, she brings the telecommunications, and then we see white farmers on the bottom right hand corner. We have stagecoaches, we have people moving with her across the country. And who is on the far left? Who are the people being pushed out and pushed away? We have Native Americans. This is the idea of manifest destiny, that there was nothing that could stop this progress from east to west. It was thought to be the destiny of the American people to expand all the way from the East Coast, which is what we have here in this picture. This is America in 1763. This is when we had just 13 colonies hugging the coast. And you can see that there was, at this time, not just these 13 colonies hugging the coast, but there was other countries and other empires. There was, of course, the Spanish, which we'll see that they themselves lost Mexico to an independence movement, and then we took land from them. But we believed that it was our destiny to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It seemed a bit of a dream when we first started arguing this, but that dream became a reality. Well, the U.S. also, in their desire to expand to the west, they get much of that through the Louisiana Purchase. They get much of that through the Mexican-American War. But then if you look at the upper northwest part of this map, you'll notice that there is another European power in green. And that European power in green is Russia. And we are given the opportunity to buy Russia, and we take that opportunity. Russia is massive, and when we are given the opportunity, the U.S. bought in 1867 land from Russia, which would be modern-day Alaska. And here is a comparison. Looking at the size of Alaska to the continental lower 48 states, Alaska is huge, and at the time, our purchase of Alaska was widely considered a mistake. People complained, they made fun of, they said it was a huge waste of money, but it turned out to be an incredible investment because Alaska would be a source of gold, Alaska would be a source of natural gas and oil, and so this, what was considered then a foolish mistake, became one of the most important acquisitions of land the United States would have. Moving forward, how do we now connect this ever-growing country? Well, one way we connect this ever-growing country is through the expanding power and the expanding influence of rail. You can see the three different phases of expansion of rail here in this diagram. We have the 1840s, the 1850s, and the 1860s, and you can see this exponential growth of American rail. Rail starts in Great Britain, and like so many British inventions, we take it, we modify it, and we push it farther than the British ever thought that we would be able to. This is what's going to help connect the East physically with the West. And one of the greatest endeavors to connect East and West is going to be a transcontinental railroad. This, in 1869, we see in Utah, there would be the completion of a transcontinental railroad. That would happen in 1869. You can see that this is a linking of established rail networks in the East with the new rail network, the Central Pacific Railroad in the West. One group is going to be building from California to Utah, the other from the east to Utah, one crossing the Great Plains, a treeless arid region, the other going through the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, all this to connect the United States physically. This is the Transcontinental Railroad. Here there's a group building the Transcontinental Railroad across the Great Plains, a place without trees. They would have to bring in the lumber, bring in the labor, bring in the food, bring in the materials. Here's a picture from the group moving in from California, having to blast through mountain, going through snow. In fact, some conditions said that in one day, 10 feet of snow fell in a day. These are the conditions the Transcontinental Railroad were being built in. And finally, it came to a completion. Upon its completion, here it is in Utah, the East and West meeting, it was the longest railroad in the world by far at 1,700 1,775 miles. 1,775 miles. By one estimate, the Union Pacific, this was one of the railroad companies, required between 3.8 million and 4.3 million spikes to build the railroad. 3.8 and 4.3 million spikes to build the railroad. Those are the actual kind of like nails that go in to get this rail into the ground. This massive accomplishment now opened the West to settlement. It gave people encouragement that the United States was now connecting its world of manifest destiny. And what helped connect it even more was that free land was offered to any who would be willing to settle it. If you were willing to settle it, if you were willing to farm and develop it, you were offered land by the United States government. This is an issue we've earlier discussed. Now, this is an incredible transformation because for most of the 19th century, the U.S. was not a global power. For most of the 19th century, the U.S. was not a global power. But something changed. Something had happened in the 19th century to make the United States go from not a global power to a rising power in global politics. That change was the Industrial Revolution. The new wealth and power was brought by the Industrial Revolution. You see machines and factories, all this wealth. This was new to the United States. And this growth of America's power was only because of the Industrial Revolution. Again, remember, where did the Industrial Revolution begin? It began in Britain. What started in Britain would be continued in the United States, and it would expand in ways that even the British would be surprised and shocked by. The U.S. now, with new wealth and new power, began to turn its attention to the Pacific Ocean. The United States began to turn its attention to the Pacific Ocean. We've kind of wrapped up the West. We've defeated Native Americans in wars. We've defeated Mexico. We've purchased Alaska. We've clarified the border of Oregon and Washington with the British. And now we're looking to expand in this world of industrial trade, this world that the Industrial Revolution has created, where wheat grown in California is being sent all the way to Great Britain. It's this interconnected world. And what do we need to connect the world in a way that will allow our ships to sail it? Well, we need coaling stations. And that's the beauty of these islands in the Pacific. They're places where we can take our ships, we can refuel our ships, and we can move our goods around the world. And so here we see American coaling stations. You can see that, our desire, if you look at the map, is to start in San Francisco, and we want to go 2,000 miles. And what is the first major islands we find? Well, it's Hawaii. We're going to put that on the list of areas that we're going to want to take over. You go to the west yet again, another 1,350 miles midway, an island that the U.S. takes and owns. We see the Wake Islands, another 1,000 miles away, owned by the United States. Another 1,350 miles, we see the island of Guam. That's part of the United States to this day. We'll talk about how we get that shortly. And then 1,500 miles later, the Philippines, which we'll also mention, we also take over. Our desire is to get to where? Where are we trying to go? We're trying to go to Asia. There's markets there. There's money to be made there. We want to be part of that. The United States is a country with two oceans, Atlantic to the east, Pacific to the west, and we realize there's money to be made by looking west. There's a problem, though. The problem is, even though the first place we looked to expand was Hawaii, even though the first country we looked to expand to is Hawaii, there's a problem in that Hawaii was an independent nation. Here is a picture of the Queen of Hawaii. They're an independent nation. They actually invited and they allowed Americans to come and plant coffee and sugarcane and pineapple and things of that nature. And it was these American planters who realized that their future, these white American planters realized their future would be stronger with the United States, that they overthrew the Queen in 1895. This independent nation was overthrown by these white American planters inside Hawaii. And after they arrested the Queen in 1895, they called up the United States and said, hey, we'd love to be annexed by you. And the United States uncritically said yes. This was not the desire of the Hawaiian people. This was not the desire of the Hawaiian government. It was a small group of American white planters who overthrew the Hawaiian independent queen, had her thrown in jail, and then said, hey, U.S., will you take us over? The U.S. said, sure. Another factor that continued American expansion was another war. We talked about the Mexican-American War. Well, there's yet another war of expansion, and that's the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was fought in 1895 with Spain. We don't have time to talk about the reasons why we went to this war, but there was allegedly abuses in Cuba that we were looking out for the Cuban people. We didn't think they were treated right. We had a ship in Havana Harbor called the USS Maine. It blew up. There was a tragic accident that we actually blamed the Spanish government for, and there you go, we are in war. Now, there's other details we're not going to get into, but as the result, this was actually another quick victory in the Spanish-American War, and it resulted in us getting all the land marked in red, closest to the United States. What do we get out of the Spanish-American War? We get Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, still part of the United States today. Everyone born in Puerto Rico is an American citizen. Out of the Spanish-American War, we also get in red the island of Guam, still part of the United States to this day. To this day, it's closer for people in Guam to get medical treatment in Hong Kong than to come to Hawaii, one of the 50 states, for treatment. If you're an American in Guam, it's closer for you to go to Tokyo for shopping, for a trip, for a vacation, than it is for you to go to Los Angeles. Guam, still part of the United States. Guam was something that we got in this Spanish-American War. And then there's one last part of the world we took over, which was the Philippines. You might notice a pattern that this war was allegedly over Cuba. This war was about abuses in Cuba. But we didn't let this war go to waste. Never let a war go to waste was the idea. Just like the fighting with the Mexican-American War was the battle over the Texas border, but we took California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, and parts of Wyoming as a result of that. In the same way, this war with Spain was about Cuba. It was about local events, and we said, don't waste this war. Take the Philippines, take Guam, take Puerto Rico while we're at it. The American president at the time that continues in the 20th century to argue for our growth is President Teddy Roosevelt. And here's a political cartoon with Teddy Roosevelt with a cannon, and in front of that cannon is a Latin American leader, because there was this idea that as we, the United States, were growing in power, our military can deal with, our military can settle, our military can defeat any Latin American resistance. For example, we wanted to build a canal through Panama. At the time, Panama was owned by Colombia, and Colombia said no. Well, we sent guns, and we sent support, and we told the people of Panama, haven't you always wanted to be independent from Colombia? And as soon as we helped Panama get their independence from Colombia, we negotiated and worked our way in to have a canal that would be built in Panama. We forced our way into countries that would tell us no. President Teddy Roosevelt came to believe in something we've talked about before. This is the idea that white culture, white power is supreme. It's called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, and that is what Teddy Roosevelt came to believe. This is the belief that white American culture was superior to most of Latin America. And if any country says no, if any country gets in the way, it is our right and responsibility to intervene. In fact, they are just a small speed bump in the way of us getting what we want. In 1904, there is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine tells Europe, hey, Europe, by the way, you cannot intervene. Europe, don't come over here. Well, in 1904, the Roosevelt corollary declared that the U.S. had the right in Latin America to intervene wherever we want. We say, we give ourselves permission, and we say, we have the right to intervene wherever we want. And this is what that looks like. It means that all throughout the early 1900s, the end of the 1800s, we get involved a lot. We get involved a lot. All these different countries we have a presence in. We send troops in various times, in various years, to Mexico, Guatemala. Nicaragua itself was invaded 6 times we invaded Nicaragua. Panama, Haiti, Honduras invaded about 6 times. Cuba, troops occupied about 5 times. Dominican Republic. All these different islands, these countries, these Latin American nations would see American intervention. This is what Roosevelt said. He said that any country we think that we need to get involved with, we will. The U.S. gave ourselves the right to invade any nation that they thought needed help. And usually, we thought countries needed help that had things that we wanted. We would invade whenever we thought we could benefit. Next, we invade and intervene in at least 8 different countries. 8 different countries we intervene in. Well, we're not the only country to experience manifest destiny. We also have the example of Russia. Here you see Russia expanding not from east to west, but from west to east. You might remember Russia had always felt backwards. They were slow in westernization. They embarrassingly lost a war with Japan, the Japanese-Russo War, and they also desire to be a growing power. Russia's greatest challenge, as you might recall, is their lack of a warm water port, but they will expand slowly but surely. Here on the map you can see the ethnic map of Russia. Everything in that reddish pink are the white Russians, the white European-based Russians, but you can see they're not the only ethnic group. This is a multi-ethnic empire, and as they move to the east, they're going to be conquering indigenous native people that are not white, that are not part of this European cultural background. Those people that they conquer are actually, particularly those in the Far East, relatives of Native Americans today. You might remember that all Native Americans crossed the Bering Strait, we believe, and so all the Native Americans who came over are related to these Far Eastern Russian Siberian people. You might further remember that Mexicans mostly are mestizo, that most Mexicans are mestizo, that mestizo means you're half white, half Native American, and that means that Mexican Americans, their heritage could be further traced then by extension to these people groups. Here's a picture of some of these native Russians in the Far East, just like we had Native Americans we conquered, that we took over, that they were not as technologically superior as the white United States forces. These ethnic indigenous Russians were not as advanced as their white Russian conquerors either. As the white Russians from the European side came with guns, these native Russians in Siberia had bow and arrow and leather armor, and as brave as they were, their bravery would not stop bullets. So Russia definitely interested in expansion, and the person who's going to help that expansion is going to be Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great is going to be the one to expand, and she takes a lot of land from the withering Ottoman Empire. The withering Ottoman Empire. And as she expands from the Ottoman Empire, Catherine the Great, who's the first to really, or who's one of the many to really push the expansion, she takes over many native peoples, as we saw. We even see that the Russians get as far in 1808 as Alaska, which we mentioned. They saw a permanent Russian presence in Alaska in 1808. And now Russia is interested in not only pushing to the east, but pushing to another area. They push to take over Central Asia. And that puts a rivalry between two countries, a rivalry between Russia and the British. Here in this political cartoon, you can see in the very middle is Afghanistan, with the British coming up from India. The British had India, they had modern-day Pakistan. The British wanted Afghanistan. The Russians are moving to the south. They also want Afghanistan. And so here you have countries having to make a decision. What do you do when two countries want to be your quote-unquote friends? Who do you trust? Can you play them off one another? This led to a rivalry between Russia and the British. This was called the Great Game. The Great Game, like a competition. How can I get these countries to invest in me without being conquered by these countries? All in all, this saw countries like Afghanistan caught in the middle. Caught in the middle. How do you avoid being conquered? And finally, here we are, 19th, 20th century manifest destinies. We have two empires that would be the leading players of the 20th century, the American Empire and the Russian Empire. The American Empire, which started with manifest destiny. We crossed the plains, linked the country with telegraph and the train. We would not only defeat Mexican-American people in the country of Mexico, expanding our country, would also defeat Native American people in expansion of manifest destiny, believing in our cultural superiority. We'd also expand to islands of the Pacific, taking over Hawaii, taking over Guam, taking over the Philippines, but we would also give ourselves the right to intervene anywhere we want, invading numerous Latin American nations whenever we thought it was in our interest. Russia continued to expand as well, trying to vindicate itself as being backwards from the rest of Europe. They expand, and they create a vast empire, the largest land-based empire of their time, going all the way across Siberia, conquering native peoples as well, and looking to expand into Central Asia, taking over Muslim people groups, as they also want to flex their muscles and show that they have arrived as a European power. It's no surprise then that these two countries will eventually be the leading countries from the middle of the 1940s on, in a period that we'll later call the Cold War.